Very pleased today to have two very qualified speakers to talk about the subject, navigating the complexities of grief and loss. And really wanted to do this for them since it feels like that grief and loss are happening on so many levels in so many of our lives. So I'm really looking forward to this. Our two speakers are Leah Blackwell and Rumi Sonye. Leah served as a chaplain at Los Alamos Visiting Nurse Service, where she helped others navigate and find meaning in end-of-life circumstances. She's also a grief group facilitator through Golden Willow Retreat Center. She currently works at Los Alamos Retired Senior Organization, a new position for her, and she's doing their programming and marketing there. She's passionate about grief education for people of all ages. Rumi is a licensed New Mexico attorney by day, and then on the side, he's a volunteer grief facilitator with the Grief Center of New Mexico, where he has supported grieving youth and families for the past 9 years. He also helps train new grief facilitators. Drawing from both his personal experience with loss and more than 20 years of public speaking, Rumi brings deep empathy, compassion, and practical insight to young people and to others he serves. So following our usual sort of format, we'll have them speak for roughly 30 minutes or so, and then do Q&A for a little bit. I sort of think of it more as questions and comments. Then afterwards, if you still would really like to just discuss this a little further, please join us at the co-op for lunch. Both of our speakers are available to do that, so we can go over there, at roughly 12:45, 1 o'clock, and have lunch together. So we'll turn it over to Leah and Rumi. Which one of you goes first? To Leah. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tyler. Thanks, everyone, for being here today. I'm really excited to share a little bit about grief and loss. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in so we have enough time to get through all the things we're going to talk about today. But we're going to talk about navigating the complexity of grief and loss. I'm going to talk a little bit about the basics of what grief is, what it looks like, how we can support ourselves and each other in grief. And then Rumi's going to take over after that and dig a little deeper into complexities, what it looks like for individuals and different cultures. So I'll go ahead and start. So I want to start by differentiating grief and loss and kind of give a definition of what grief is. So loss is any time that a person's foundation or perception of reality or safety has shifted, cracked, or shattered. And I should say that this is the definition that Ted Wired from Golden Willow Retreat gives. And this is kind of what my training is informed by. Grief, however, is a natural healing process of the psyche in response to loss. So it's a dynamic and evolving experience that looks different for everyone. But at its core, it's how the heart and mind respond to the absence of someone or something that provided meaning, security, or joy. And it's universal, right? We all go through it. Even if you haven't had a significant loss of a loved one in your life, you've experienced loss, right? In a multitude of ways. Therefore, you've experienced grief. So loss of a job, a relationship, changes in mobility or health, even the loss of a long-held dream. It could be political grief. It could be grief for our world and the state of things. It's simply unavoidable, right? So really the foundation of grief literacy and understanding begins with acknowledging that there's a lot of loss in life and therefore grief. So when we sit with this, we can start to embrace grief as an essential part of our lives. It's an extension of love. It's the ongoing expression of care for something precious to us. So kind of the basics of our modern Western understanding of grief are based in the work of Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And I bring this up because it's really part of our cultural discourse around grief. I'm sure you guys have heard of these 5 stages. And the book on death and dying was published in 1969, and so obviously that's a little dated. But our foundation comes from these 5 stages or aspects, as I'll call them in a minute. So since then, there's been obviously a mountain of research, and there are different models, different ways of looking at grief, but we're gonna dive into some of the basics today. So let's see here. So one of the main things we've learned since this came out is that the aspects of grief are not linear. You can't check them off and say, okay, I'm done with denial, I'm moving on to anger. We tend to flow in and out of all of these aspects, even in a matter of moments. So language matters. The Golden Willow model has reworked some of the language that instead of saying stages or phases, they use the word aspects. Because they aren't linear, and we can't proceed to the next one, we flow in and out. So we're not trying to conquer them, we're trying to sit with them and embrace them. One of my favorite quotes by Carl Jung is that emotions are not meant to be conquered, they're meant to be understood. And I think this really translates well to the experience of grief. Again, you may have heard the phrase by Dr. Dan Siegel, name it to tame it. So we're really acknowledging what we're experiencing so we can have agency within the process. And one of the most useful words I've learned in this work is the word allow. Allow, sit with it, active awareness. And when we get this literacy, we can really participate in what that looks like. So let's run through the 5 aspects, as we're going to call them, of that traditional or that classic work by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So denial, and I like the way that Ted reworks this as insulation. So insulation has a different connotation than denial, right? I can hear someone saying, well, you're just in denial. It feels like an accusation. But insulation is really a protective space that our psyche develops to help us buffer us from the enormity of the loss all at once. It can be impossible to fully process. So it's that buffer from the initial blow. It's our soul's way of going inward and taking care. And really with each of these aspects, we want to normalize this. We want to say, okay, I'm in the insulation phase. This isn't something to walk away from. It's something that I'm going to embrace. And so another aspect is anger, or as Ted calls it, protest. This can be an escape valve for intense emotions. It may be our first true feeling after our loss, but we want to be careful complications that can happen when protest becomes resentment. So with all of these aspects, embracing them doesn't mean getting stuck in them. And we really want to watch for that, getting stuck. So the next one is bargaining, or as Ted calls it, connecting the dots. So I really like this quote from his work, Witnessing Ted. The brain strives to connect the dots to make sense of the loss. It continually processes the events of the past in an attempt to make the future more predictable and thus safer. The bargaining aspect is the brain's debate with the illusion of control. So that kind of looks like thoughts of if only I had, what if, I wish I had. And this doesn't mean necessarily I wish I had done XYZ to prevent the loss. It can be, I wish I had said thank you. I wish I had been kinder. This is natural. This is what the brain does to connect the dots. And we want to watch out for complications with this aspect, that intense feelings of shame or guilt. We want to be aware of that. And then the next one is depression, or as Ted calls it, surrender. And this quote, I think, encapsulates it well. When all efforts to avoid the pain of our reality fail, when our debate with the illusion of control and bargaining is exhausted, when denial is no longer working, we surrender to profound sorrow. And then finally, acceptance or acknowledgement. Again, I like this language because acceptance doesn't mean that we've reached a point where the loss is okay, right? Acknowledgement is integrating this into part of our story. So I want to touch base on how to support others in grief. And this is really just an extension of this awareness that we're providing for ourselves, this active presence. But it looks a little different in that we have to put ourselves out there, right? And there's always risk with that. We often just don't know what to do for someone. We have great intentions, but we're really at a loss. And that's because the truth is we can't fix it. You know, the worst has happened. And I think one of the barriers we face to supporting others is the fear of saying the wrong thing. And the truth is we can say the wrong thing. I've done it many, many times. But we shouldn't let that fear keep us from acknowledging someone's loss. And really where we want to start is in a place of friendship, active witnessing, or presence from others. I'm sure you've heard of active listening, but what that really boils down to me is putting everything aside in the thinking mind to open your heart and attention to someone. So we know it's the nature of the mind to be consistently anticipating what's next. But in attending to someone, we're often thinking about how we're going to respond rather than truly hearing. So some things that help are reflective questions, like, I hear you saying that, XYZ, clarifying, not offering suggestions or ways to get them out of it, and not equating everything they say to our own experience. So we want to empathize without co-opting someone else's story. Let's see. So if I'm any example, it doesn't take a degree in counseling to provide a lifeline and a safe space for someone in grief. It just requires presence. And I have a little anecdote that I think really illustrates this well. It's based on this book by Shohei Morimoto, Rental Person. And I'm going to read a little story about basically encapsulating what this book is about. He says, I rent myself out to do nothing. Shohei Morimoto has a master's degree in physics, lived in Tokyo, and was, in his own words, an ordinary, quiet guy with no special talents. But one day, tired of jobs that didn't satisfy him, he posted a tweet that changed everything. I rent myself out to do nothing. I can be with you, listen to you, accompany you. I don't cook, I don't clean, I don't give advice. I simply exist with you. He did it as a joke, but the next day he had over 500 messages. A woman asked him to accompany her to sign her divorce papers. She didn't want to do it alone. A young man leaving the hospital after an operation asked him to walk home with him in silence. An elderly woman invited him to eat, just so she wouldn't have to be alone. And what exactly do you do, a journalist asked. Nothing, I'm just there. But sometimes being there is everything. He doesn't give advice. He doesn't intend to change lives. He simply becomes a silent witness to the small struggles. Today he has over 4,000 clients. They call him the man who does nothing, but deep down, Shohei does everything. He does what many don't know how to do, to be present. When asked if this made him feel lonely, he replied, no, I need company too, but without masks, without expectations, just two human beings sharing the same time without wanting to change each other. Sometimes what heals the most is the simplest. Someone who doesn't come to save you, but to sit beside you as you weather the storm. So here's a little story in my life that represents this. I was grieving the loss of a dear friend last summer and really, really struggling. And a friend of mine was just truly present for me. And I want to tell about this because I think the word presence, it kind of sounds, it's like this big idea, like what does it mean? And this is an example. They called me up one day and they said, hey, do you want to go to the grocery store? And I said, no, absolutely not, I don't. and they said, great, I'll pick you up in 10 minutes. Okay, so we go to the grocery store, and he said, I really don't feel like going in. I'm not feeling good. And he said, I know. I brought you a soda, and here's the tapes and the tape deck, and just hang out, and after this, we'll go run some more errands. And that was exactly what I needed. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that we kidnap our friends and take them to the grocery store, but it's just an example of presence. So in trying to understand more about the experience of grief, I think we have to be really brave by beginning to face our own fears about loss. And when we move into a deeper understanding, we can begin to allow ourselves to experience the full spectrum of what it means to be human. When we allow the aspects to ebb and flow as they naturally occur, we are healing. Grief is like observing the waves of the ocean, riding it like the tide. Sometimes the water just tickles our toes, and sometimes it crashes into us like a 50-foot wave. Allow it. Surrender to it. You will surface. Healing, like life's greatest lessons, is not about a destination, but about a way of being, of receiving and acknowledging. So thinking that someday we'll be over it or done grieving isn't realistic, though it does get easier to bear. I heard a quote by Jay Shetty that I really like, and he says that grief is like a heavy stone that we carry. And though it never gets lighter, we grow stronger to carry it with more ease. So as we contemplate grief and bear witness to it in the lives of others and sit with our own, we can strengthen those muscles that help us carry it. Thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Rumi, who's going to explore this in a little more depth today.
So, I haven't been in a church in a long time. My dad was a pastor, and I kind of avoided going to church for a bit. But I really appreciate. I really appreciate being here in this context, because for me, grief work is my passion, and connecting with people at whatever level they are to talk about grief is incredibly important to me. Partly because I didn't get a chance to do it for a very long time. When I grew up in Peru, I was a missionary kid. My dad was a pastor, and he was killed by a group called the Shining Path. And at the time, because of cultural understandings, I cried at my dad's memorial, and I was shamed by my uncles for doing so, because culturally that was not allowed. And also, like, how dare I mourn this great man that is certainly in a better place, as in heaven? These were the things that I didn't need to hear. These were the things that a 13-year-old child does not need to hear, that they cannot cry for their own father, right? And I got into my 20s and I went to therapy, and I started learning about processing, about grieving, about talking, and then became an attorney, and I thought I'd work through all this different stuff. And I was representing the Rio Rancho Chamber of Commerce. And we had a guest speaker. We had a monthly speaker, kind of like what you guys are doing here, a forum for nonprofit organizations to talk about their, work with all these business owners in Rio Rancho. And this lady talked about this, what was at the time called, in 2016, the Children's Grief Center of New Mexico. And I didn't know this place existed. And she talked about it, she talked about what they do, about what space they hold for people to talk about their grief and cry and just be with each other. And I cried there in front of all these business people. And I told Jade, I want to be involved with this for the rest of my life. Tell me how I can help. Holding grief is magical. Holding space for grief is magical. And it's something I couldn't do when I first started it. I thought I could. I thought I had it down, but I couldn't. I had to grow and I had to learn. And in the process of learning and growing to be a facilitator, I also learned that, like, we live in a very multicultural place, and we have to understand that there's people of all different kinds in this place. And there's a lot of kids like me that when I was a child, they are not allowed to cry. So at the Grief Center, it's now called the Grief Center, they merged with the New Mexico Resource Center, and now they're called the New Mexico Grief Center, and they try to serve the whole state, but they have groups in Albuquerque, and it's a passion for me to do this. And I want to start a teen group here in Los Alamos, and we're working with Christine to try to do that, and the Family Strength Network. And I think it's incredibly important to have these things, right? But for everybody, but so much grief is happening in this state. And people see it, right? I don't know if you guys have heard of this. I know the Unitarian Church really does look at, a lot of different faiths and doesn't get stuck on anything like the fundamentalist church I grew up in. But there's this South Valley pastor South Valley Albuquerque, called Richard Rohr. And he has this quote that says, "Pain that is not transformed is transmitted." And that is incredibly powerful. And I understand that because I was a dysfunctional person that was causing pain in other people's life until I started working on my own grief, until I started working on my own issues, on my own loss, and understanding those things. And if I wasn't able to hold space for these people that I was trying to facilitate early on, because I hadn't worked on really transforming my own grief, right? And I'm still in the process. I think we're always in the process, right? It's not a destination, it's a path. And for grief, that is the same thing, talking about like that stone, right? This huge stone that is this weight, and you grow this muscle. So eventually, you get so much bigger than this grief that it's like a pebble in your pocket. And you feel that pebble in your pocket, and you know it's still there every time, and you remember the love, and you remember those things, but it's no longer weighing you down, no longer destroying you, because you have grown. Not because that grief has gotten smaller, but because you have grown. I love that metaphor. And I think when we're dealing with people that have grief, one of the things that we have to understand is that when that person dies, they're not gone. Whether you believe, in any religious stuff or not, that person's not gone, right? Because actually, this is something that C.S. Lewis said. He said, the death of a loved one is like an amputation. And one of my favorite metaphors, and I actually knew about this before I knew about the Grief Observed, right? That was written by C.S. Lewis about dealing with the loss of his wife. And it's an incredibly powerful book with incredibly quotes, amazing quotes about how to deal with grief and how to hold space as the observer. Not as somebody that's going to help or do something for this person, but as somebody that's a companion next to you, just holding space for you to be there, right? And that's all we need, because the truth is that, we can't help anybody. They can only help themselves. We can only grow through our own grief. We have to process our own grief. Nobody else can process it for us, right? And part of that process, when somebody dies, it's like an amputation, because I don't know if you guys have heard this, there's this thing called phantom limb. You can still feel pain in a limb. Why? Because we have that area of the brain, that somatosensory cortex area of your brain, where your arm still belongs. And when you lose that arm, you don't lose everything that you connect to that arm with. It's the same when you lose a person, right? When somebody dies, that part of the brain is still there. So there's this, we were talking earlier about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and there's this idea that you go through all these stages. My favorite concept is this continuing bonds concept that says when that person dies, they're not gone. You have to redefine your relationship with that person. And I think that that's now my goal when I facilitate grief, is how can I hold space for this person that's going through this stuff right now, for them to redefine their relationship with this person, right? And it's never simple. I mean, a lot of times when somebody dies, there's all this pain and anger towards that person. So what do we do with that, right? Only we know that answer. And one of the things culturally, right, I started this conversation by telling you guys that culturally I couldn't do something, right? You're gonna have to be in front of people of all kinds, women, men, non-binary people, queer, trans people that you're holding space for, right? And some of them are gonna be also from different cultures, from different place. Ultimately, right, it's about what is individual to that person, about how they're grieving. We can talk about all these different models of grieving. My favorite book on grief is this little book called Grief is a Mess. And it's this children's book that really just tells you, like, dude, whatever you're feeling, it's fine. That's what grieving is. It sucks, it's horrible, but that's what grief is. It's a complex situation. And ultimately, I guess that's what I'm here to talk about, is to just tell you guys grief is a mess. And when we're doing it, we have to be willing to hold that space for that person to sort out that mess. And I think that's about what I have to say. Sorry that was kind of all over the place, but that's just kind of how I am. And if anybody has any questions, I love to answer those.
I'll roam around. Anybody want to comment or ask questions? Before we came in, you were talking about doing grief groups with young people, and you were talking about doing this in a community near the Navajo Nation and having all these children there on Father's Day, children who had lost fathers.
Yeah.
That just sounded really powerful, and I wonder if you could just tell a little bit about that story.
So one of the things that the Grief Center of New Mexico does, right, the New Mexico Grief Center does, is do a camp every year called Camp Corazon. And I'm passionate about it, and I'm there every year. And we actually need men to be big brothers for some boys. So if you guys, anybody gets touched by this story when I'm done, like, reach out to me. If you know anybody that would like to come and do this camp, we have the orientation on Tuesday. I can probably find you a Zoom link for it. But let me tell you about this camp, all right? Camp Corazon has been going on for a long time, a couple decades now. And it's this camp we do across different parts of the state. It'll be in the Manzanos this year. 2 years ago, we did it in Vanderwagen, New Mexico, which is not far from the Navajo Nation. And we do it in different areas to try to like target those areas. Because a lot of these kids that go in Albuquerque, they get to go to the Grief Center, right? They're in Albuquerque, they get to do it. A lot of people don't get that chance to go all the way to Albuquerque and attend grief centers. So this camp gives them a chance to be able to really get immersive and really talk about it. And magic happens in camp. Overnight camp is magic for a lot of different things. That's why I'm a big fan of camps. But especially Camp Corazon for grief is incredibly magical. I've seen things happen that I can never explain. But for example, okay, 2 years ago, we did camp on Father's Day weekend at Vanderwagen, New Mexico, and most of these were boys from the Navajo Nation who had lost fathers, a lot of them in very violent ways. And people be like, hey, why are you being crazy and putting a bunch of kids that lost their dads together in a camp on Father's Day? But that was the best place they could be. That was the most healing experience they could have. To be able to not be alone, but be with a bunch of other kids that have gone through very similar things, you know? And there were boys and girls and a lot of different people, but most of them were fathers' losses, but the boys were very angry. There was a lot of anger there, and I always got there. And the first day these kids get here, we get there on Thursday, and we do some training, and then the kids get there Friday morning, and they stay there till Sunday. They got there on Friday, and I was scared because there was so much emotion. First day it was chaos, it was crazy. By that night, they said they wouldn't sleep. They went through, but they started connecting, they started talking. By the next day, they started really sharing their stories. They started realizing why they were all there. They started really understanding that nobody that they'd really been talking to really understood, but everybody around them did. They understood what they were going through. And by the end of it, it was the most magic. By Saturday night, we throw a big fire and we do s'mores. And we sing songs, and people early on get to write letters to their loved ones. And you see these kids crying, hugging each other, supporting each other. And after that, we throw this huge rave. We get all these glow toys. We get donations from things, and we have all these glow sticks and lights and beautiful things, and we throw some music on, and everybody just lets go. By the last day, Sunday, these kids are the best friends. They're talking about their loved ones with passion, without fear. It's something beautiful. And that's what I'm saying. If anybody wants to help volunteer for Camp Corazon, we really need male people to volunteer. So I had to pitch that out there too.
Thank you.
Yeah. So talking about like dance and these types of things that you guys do with youth, and are there other somatic practices that you use when you're like in grief group and facilitation? I was just curious what some of those might be, those types of somatic practices that help people like connect with their bodies and things.
Well, Rumi and I had the pleasure of participating in the Teen Summit on Friday night, and the teens organized this event, and I think the theme was, it was a toolkit for life or how to save a life, something like that. And our panel was on spirituality. And we talked about how spirituality can mean religion, but for a lot of us, it's meaning of life, right? What the big questions, how do we connect to this? And we talked about that a lot. We talked about music being this connector. We talked about looking at the stars. We talked about, helping others, right? I had this anecdote that I really saw this in Santa Fe. I saw a woman fall off her bike, and I saw someone run to help her and to pick her up and get all of her things and put her back on her bike. It's these moments of connectivity, right? And we're seeking with kids and with adults too to find these moments of real connection and presence. So we did a meditation. I'm a big proponent of that. And then Rumi led us into an ecstatic dance exercise. So we had this kind of presence of like, sometimes we need stillness and sometimes we need to move. Sometimes we need to just tap into that spirituality. And so coming from my work as a chaplain, that word, people immediately say, oh, you're with the church. I went to the Pueblo one time. They said, sure, a chaplain can come. We don't really know what that is. We thought you were going to come in with robes and incense and try to save us. And I was like, no. For me, it was meaning of life. How can I help you narrate what is meaningful to you? And so I think a lot of those, back to your question, a lot of those things really tapping into presence, right? And what does this mean? So I don't know if that answers your question, but I got on a tangent about the Teen Summit. We've had a great weekend exploring grief with people, so it's been really cool.
So, but going back to somatic thing too, right? Like the dance and movement is incredibly special, but just getting kids to move and talk is something special. Actually doing arts and crafts, amazing. And doing it very like theme-oriented for stuff. I would love doing sugar skulls and talking about altares during Dia de los Muertos as a way of talking about memorializing your losses, right? And all of a sudden, a lot of kids will start talking, oh, I didn't get to go to the funeral, And then it's like, oh, how else can you memorialize your loved one? Because we need that. It's part of our human spirituality to do those. Whether it's connected to a religion or not, we need that, right? One of the things that's really hard in modern societies that we don't rest with our dead anymore. They don't stay in our house if we don't clean them. We ever since we've had embalming, we've disconnected from ourselves. So in a lot of ways, we need to learn how to connect with our dead. And that's something incredibly important. And again, redefining our relationships with those people is incredibly important. And if you don't have ceremony, if you don't have process, if you don't have something, then how do you do that, right? And so, yeah, there's a somatic aspect of it, but there's also just allowing people to have that movement and talk, and allowing the space for those conversations to be able to actually process those stuff. But movement's always incredible. I love doing things like giant Jenga. Oh my gosh, like the idea that that's gonna fall, but you're dealing with these emotions. We write questions about like their loved ones. How was that person? How like they're moving these, or did you go to the funeral? And you're doing this with movement at the same time, being careful with that, but you're having these deep conversations because you're allowing that space, right? So if you're gonna talk to your friend maybe about the death of their loved one, right? Maybe don't just go have a conversation. Maybe go play, pool, or, go on a hike or do something interesting, because that's probably going to be a lot easier to get a conversation going than just, hey, tell me about your grief, right? That's
Right.
usually not going to work.
Yeah,
So,
I like that you brought that up. I did the training at the Grief Center in Albuquerque. Rumi was one of my instructors. That was really cool. But we had actual activities that explored each of these aspects, because, it's like, okay, great, I know what I'm experiencing. What do I do with it? Like, I'm angry. What do I do with it? And it's really special at the Grief Center that, activities like that lend themselves to, it works really well with kids, but I think we should incorporate this more with adults. Like, one of the activities we did, this was awesome, is we wrote down everything that made us mad or angry about our loss, and then we put them in a shoebox, and you could just jump on top of it, or you could hit it with a hammer. We need these outlets, right? And I think that if any of you get a chance to do any of this training with the Grief Center, it's a life skill, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You'll see me there if you go, because I'm at all of them. So we have them in January and August, and we offer them both for for new facilitators that want to facilitate, but we also offer them as CEUs, continuing education units for mental health counselors. They want to get their yearly continuing education. That also counts for that. So it's actually a really good class. And I'm an attorney, not a mental health counselor, but again, you don't need to be a mental health counselor to hold space for people. You don't need that to teach other people to hold space for, for people that are grieving.
You mentioned, Leah, that loss can happen on all sorts of different levels. And, some of them are so striking and sudden and traumatic, that we all know why we're grieving. We may not know how or what to do, but what about the ones that are sort of slow and subtle and, and I think probably there's a lot of people in this room who have just sort of a sense of, culturally, there's a lot to grieve about right now, but it's really hard to put our fingers on what that is and when did it occur and, things like that. I mean, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah. I don't know. Is anything coming up for you?
The question was directed at you, so I was
Okay.
like that.
All right. Sorry.
You can re-ask it, though. Go ahead.
Well, no, I think it's really interesting. So in the Golden Willow Retreat model they talk about grief, being from the time we're born. Like we come into this world of change and of discomfort and horrible things, right? And really, I think getting back to just understanding that this is healing, that this anger, or what, thinking about the world right now, all these things that are happening that are outside of our control, and the grief that we're experiencing is tremendous, like you said. And the more we can work through just education on what this is, the more we can take action, I think. I think about, for example, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Those are mothers that have had children pass away in terrible accidents. So it can be, we can, like Rumi said, pain that isn't transformed is transmitted. I think we can go inward and we can say, okay, what is in my sphere of influence? What small actions can I take toward healing? And I think grief can be a real motivator for that. That's an example that comes up. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you.
I find myself living life in a way that has an interesting side to it, that I, as I've gotten older, find myself giving a kind of a snicker to all sorts of facets of the world out there that are kind of, they ought to be different than they are, but that's, out of my control, so I snicker at it. And I find it very useful in a way that comes up so often. I don't work at it, but I've gotten used to it being there, and I can see that there are moments where that is needed more than just everyday little events.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's interesting, like working with adult groups, like in comparison with teens, right? When adults are grieving, like it's mostly just, trying to use the right word here, complaining, right? About their lives, about like the stuff that's really hard, about all those things. And sometimes that's what we need, is to just be around other people that get it, right? That really understand what's going on, instead of like trying to solve solutions, right? To resolve the problems of the world, right? And I think that's what's great, a lot of times good about grief groups. Another quote by C.S. Lewis in Grief Observed is about talking about how grieving people should be treated like leopards. Let them be amongst each other, because the rest of the population just has no business being around them while they're grieving. And that's something that sometimes, then that's part of the reason why I believe in the grief group model, right? About people that are grieving coming together and doing it together. The facilitators, like me and Leah, when we're there, we're not there to bring any magical insight. We're there for them to have that conversation.
Yeah, and going back to just, what do you do that allow word keeps coming back to me, that presence. There's a Rumi poem, not this Rumi, but the OG Rumi. that is called the guest house. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's This Being Human. I won't quote it correctly, but This Being Human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Welcome them all. Meet them at the door laughing, right? Because as soon as they come in and you serve them a cup of tea, you know, they're going to be gone, and it makes way for the next one, which is just what it is to be human. So I think allowing that grief when he shows up, come on in, I'll serve you a cup of coffee. Sometimes for me, grief is, he's in my house, but he's standing at the window. You know, he's there, but he's not in my face. Sometimes he's like, Leah, look at me, I'm right here. And sometimes the visitors are a party of emotions. Mm-hmm. So I think we lean into a lot of metaphor. I think we, as humans, connect to story really well. Mm-hmm. And so that's something that comes up, you know, just what do you do? Allow. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions, comments? Thank you guys so much for doing this. This was wonderful. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you for giving us this opportunity. Again, this is my passion. You know, my day job is being an attorney, but this is my passion. So if you guys ever, also, if you guys want to like a ecstatic dance session here at the church, I'll totally do it.
And we didn't get the flyers ready for this yet for here in our community, but in April, Chris Massa and Terry Beery and myself are starting a Dying My Way class here. And it's going to start in April, and it's going to be on the Thursdays in April at 6 p.m. on Zoom only, because we're going to have End of Life Options New Mexico come speak to us on Zoom for a couple sessions. Amber Pope from Rivera is going to talk to us about different body disposition things that can be done, and then also hospice care. And one of the hospice care companies is going to come talk to us as well on Zoom. So we're going to have these sessions in April, starting at 6 p.m. Not the board meeting night, which is the third. There's five Thursdays in April, and not the third one because that's a board meeting night. But and then in May, on May 2nd, we're going to have a death cafe. So if you don't want to come to a death cafe, Death Cafe is a national movement where you literally set up tables and have people. There's no agenda. You sit down at the tables with folks, and there is cake provided, and you just talk about death. That is all that is. And there might be other things that come out of that. I helped co-facilitate one of these at Eugene when I was over there doing ministerial internship stuff. And what came out of the Death Cafe was people wanted a study hall session for paperwork, for like your end of life paperwork and your family's end of life paperwork or whatever. So I know this is kind of like not exactly grief, but well, it kind of relates, I guess. Death. I mean, it's death, all the things. But I just wanted to make a plug. So you'll see that information coming out soon.
Also, I had mentioned to these folks that one of the things we've learned through the Interfaith Coalition on Homelessness, which is just astounding, is that two different people who are very knowledgeable and have worked in Espanola and frontline organizations estimate that 80% of the children in the public school system there are not living with either parent. Either parent. So the tremendous amount of grief, trauma there is something that just needs to really be sort of held in mind in terms of, you know, what is needed in that community. And, you know, it's just like way beyond ICOH to do much about that, but we just have to be really aware of that as we move forward.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I know New Mexico is #1 in the nation of childhood bereavement. So, and that's defined by either having lost a parent or a sibling. And, you know, I think we often have this perception that Los Alamos is different and immune to that, and we are in many ways. But you guys have seen statistics of a lot of hard stuff here, and so just keeping that in mind, I think it's really important work. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, guys. Wonderful.